Hello, I'm Robin Morrow. Welcome to our IBBY Australia presentation prepared by Margot Lindgren and me. Poetry can bring delight and insights to children from a very young age, but some adults lack confidence in introducing poems at home or in the classroom. Today, we'll show you some picture books that are based on one complete poem, and we hope they'll inspire you to seek out more. Many families already have a nursery rhyme collection, a great starting point for a love of verse. John Newbery published his Mother Goose book in London in 1765, a forerunner to all such nursery rhyme collections. Here are two favourite picture books based on versions of traditional nursery rhymes. Each Peach Pear Plum and We're Going on a Bear Hunt have become favourites for their strong rhythm, amusing narratives, and fine illustrations. Not long after the Newbery publication, Samuel Taylor Coleridge published a long narrative poem for adults called The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And about 80 years later, the prolific Gustave Doré produced a huge folio-sized illustrated book with black and white engravings, dramatic and even melodramatic. The poem had been transformed into a collector's piece for private libraries, a forerunner for many of the books that we'll turn to now. It's not surprising that narrative poems attract illustrators and publishers to make into picture books. The Highwayman by Alfred Noyes was illustrated by Charles Keeping, and it made an impact when it appeared in 1981. Keeping's illustrations of this melodramatic and violent ballad seem to be directly descended from Gustave Doré's style. The Julia Donaldson and Axel Scheffler's Highwayman below in the slide is very different, humorous and light-hearted one. When we turned to Australian books for this topic, we found that they were almost all narrative poems in the bush ballad tradition. Maurice Saxby, in his famous History of Australian Children's Books, wrote that the modern Australian picture book sprang into life, as it were, fully formed, with the publication in 1970 of Desmond Digby's illustrations for Patterson's Waltzing Matilda, which established the picture book in this country as an art form. Patterson had written the poem at the end of the 19th century, and it had become an unofficial national anthem. When the picture book appeared in 1970, there were sighs of recognition at the familiar words and the recognisably Australian colour palette. And we note that this book includes a wordless spread, very innovative at that time. Waltzing Matilda was a trailblazer, and the publisher, William Collins, followed up with a number of Patterson ballads illustrated by the Nyland twins, who used for Mulga Bill's bicycle caricature human forms, great variety in page layout, and on every spread there were mini jokes for children to enjoy in the pictures. And Quentin Hole, a stage designer, was also asked by Collins to do bush ballad picture books, and here are the two that he did. As you would expect from a stage designer, his spread design and composition are superb. Annette MacArthur Onslow made a very different style of picture book in her Man from Snowy River, with impressionistic paintings which capture the landscape and the movement of the iconic horses riding through the snowy. Other publishers followed Collins' trend. Australian Hans Christian Andersen winner Robert Ingpen produced a very different picture book with his Clancy of the Overflow. Note that his copy is portrait-shaped, not landscape as the Collins books. This reflects the emphasis by Ingpen on the character of Clancy, so it has a lot about the man himself. And the book is a brilliant work of social history as well as illustrating the ballad. And other later people illustrated Clancy too. This is an Australian poem that is not a bush ballad, Hissed by C.J. Dennis. It is a narrative poem, and it is a simple tale of a group of children making their way home in the dark with a great build-up of tension. Hissed, hark, the night is very dark, and we've to go a mile or so across the Possum Park. Peter Goulthorpe's skillful design and technique result in an elegant book. It's very hard to find an Australian picture book of a lyrical poem. This is understandable because without action they are harder to illustrate. My Country, the popular patriotic poem by Dorothea McKellar, has been illustrated by Andrew McLean, who has a skillful light touch in depicting landscapes. Anne Bell's poem, on Your Face, was made into a picture book illustrated by Kate Burness, and it's sadly out of print. Many of Anne's poems have been published in New South Wales School Magazine, and some appeared in Beetle Soup Anthology. I, for one, would welcome more books like this. Now we turn to some nonsense poems that have become picture books. There is a rich array of nonsense poems for the major Anglophone countries. The master of nonsense, Edward Lear, was an artist himself and added witty drawings to many of his poems. The Quangle Wangle's hat cries out to be read aloud and also offers scope for a variety of interpretations by artists. It's interesting to note that Helen Oxenbury's earliest picture books included this nonsense rhyme. The original cover shows the small Olympian bear, one character in the rhyme. Of course, she never reveals the face of the Quangle Wangle himself, a special challenge of the poem, because the verse states that his face you could not see because of his huge hat. Another great favourite in the Lear poems is The Owl and the Pussycat. A number of illustrators have worked on this rollicking but poignant verse. The US illustrator Jan Brett sets her many pictures in different exotic locations. I think Edward Lear would be very surprised to find his fantasy couple in the seascape and landscape of the island of Martinique with its radiant colours. Charlotte Vauqu's book is very different, with an ethereal, almost faded palette. And Vauque has produced with Julia Donaldson a clever sequel called Further Adventures of the Owl and Pussycat, faithful to Lear in tone and vocabulary. Another nonsense poet is the US poet Ogden Nash, and a favourite of his is The Story of Isabel, a narrative poem telling of the brave and competent Isabel who conquers every bugaboo. And James Marshall's vivacious and amusing style suits it admirably. I still have trouble believing that T.S. Eliot, the same T.S. Eliot of The Wasteland and Four Quartets, turned his hand to his Old Possum book, which earned extraordinary royalties, especially after the stage show was made of Cats. These poems are not really nonsense poems, rather perhaps could be categorised as patter poems in the vein of Gilbert and Sullivan, so they're challenging to read aloud. In Eliot, as in Lear and Nash and the contemporary Julia Donaldson, we find an unerring sense for the rhyme and rhythm of such verses. Unfortunately, many people attempt to write verse texts for picture books, and some have a tin ear for the syllabification. This series of the cat books by T.S. Eliot are illustrated by cartoonist Arthur Robbins, and there are 4 of those in that set, or 5, maybe 5. And here's one from the genius of New Zealand youth literature, Margaret Mahy, who also had an unerring ear for rollicking rhyme. This one down the back of the chair, illustrated by Polly Dunbar, and the same pair produced Bubble Trouble, and then there's a summary Saturday Morning, and others of Margaret Mahy's patter poems have been made into picture books. We turn now to the most challenging category of poems for the illustrator, lyrical poems, those that don't tell a story but express observations and emotions. These are the poems about which there was a received truth when I was a young teacher, that a poem should be introduced without accompanying illustrations. By this way of thinking, a poem creates images in the mind of the reader, and any illustrations will limit the possibilities for making one's own mental images. I had absorbed this concept even as a very young reader, having noticed that my beloved copy of A Child's Garden of Verses by Robert Louis Stevenson stated on the cover, "Decorations by Eve Garnett." Decorations. Little borders and vignettes hinting at the setting, but leaving much to the imagination of the young reader. This little book, Colour, is a poem based on a poem by Christina Rossetti, but it's a very simple poem, unlike many of her others. It's a complete on the page there, just examples of each colour from the poet's close observation of the natural world. The French illustrator Laetitia Devernay has produced gentle coloured stencil type illustrations that beautifully suit this short but subtle poem. Another English writer, Walter de la Mare, created many poems that have become beloved by children. And here are a few books of his. The first does have a narrative element, tracing the ride of the witches through the night sky, and it includes a number of names of stars and constellations. Carolina Rabbi is the illustrator of this and the following three books by de la Mare. Snow, No Breath of Wind, Summer Evening, The Sandy Cat by the Farmer's Chair, beautiful orange colours, and this last one, Silver, perhaps the best known of these poems, beloved of elocution teachers. Slowly, silently, now the moon walks the night in the silver shoon, and the illustrator has beautifully evoked the silver night sky and shimmery illustrations here. Another famous Robert Louis Stevenson, another famous poet, Robert Louis Stevenson, also comes from about the same period. And one of his favourites is My Shadow. And this is a superb picture book by Penny Dale, once again, probably out of print. And she's done the almost impossible task of making this poem from about 140 years ago come right into the world of a present-day child clad in very comfortable clothes, unlike the ones that the original child, based on Robert Louis Stevenson himself, would have been wearing. And even the depiction of a nanny in this book, you will find, is very up-to-date and approachable by a modern child. Another favourite poem by R.L.S. is The Swing, and once again this has stood the test of time because the appeal of swinging is a universal joy of childhood, and this is lovely to see it represented for such young children in this superb picture book with the Canadian illustrator Julie Morstad, who uses bright colours, strong brush strokes, and simple but skillful composition in this one of The Swing. Moving from the British poets to some US writers of lyrical poetry, here's one by Carl Sandburg, Theme in Yellow. Once again, quite short and well illustrated in a book by Titania Feeney, and it does include the wonderful line that you could quote at Halloween, "I am called pumpkins." Now we come to our favourite poet here, Robert Frost from the US, and one illustrated by Vivian Menaker. The illustrator has made a book that is a complete biography in pictures, beautifully composed, but this is an example of perhaps being a little problematic about its being illustrated, in that it would be hard, once you've read this picture story book, it would be hard to unthink this life story, to imagine, say, a woman narrator speaking the words of the poem. The other book of Robert Frost that we found in picture book form, Stopping by Woods, seems to lend itself more to illustration. And here are 3 illustrators' versions. Vivian Menaker again and Susan Jeffers, superb illustrator, have each made picture book versions of this classic poem. But Margot and I both love the P.J. Lynch illustrations, as you'll see at the top of the slide. This is one picture book I would not want to return to a library if I did not own my own copy. I think to savour and reflect, especially as the poem speaks not just to young readers, but to those who are aging. But I have promises to keep. This is the ending, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Now we're going to turn to a poem by that most enigmatic of poets, Emily Dickinson, the brilliant US poet whose poems never easily lend themselves to 1 or even 2 or 3 readings. This picture book is illustrated by Tatiana Feeney. Tim Hopgood has also illustrated this amazing poem, which I really consider unillustratable, to invent a word. It's beautiful, the design and the colour are vivid and special, but I quote a Kirkus review of this book. Depicting birds and birdhouses, the illustrations won't leave young readers' interpretations to chance. And this reviewer also said, at the end of the review, visually appealing, but without adult intervention, likely to leave little ones perplexed. Perhaps it's, again, a matter of picture books being assumed for very, very young children, but I'll leave you to think about that for yourself. Another American poet, the wonderful African-American poet Langston Hughes, wrote an Earth Song, and it has been illustrated by Takesha Andrews, and it has simple, clear, strong illustrations of African-American children enjoying seasonal change, very young and strong, and I love the line, a body song, a spring song for the spring poem. Highly recommended, and it reminds me of Ezra Jack Keats, which is a high compliment in my book. Now we turn to something very different. I'd like to end with a favourite of mine. It's a book that shapes one of Christianity's classic canticles into a precious gift book for children or even for adults. The text written by that wonderful writer Catherine Paterson, and she describes it as reimagined by Catherine Paterson, so it's not just a paraphrase, it's quite her own version. And the wonderful illustrations made by the paper cut method, the same as the one that Hans Christian Andersen himself used to use, makes it into a superb book. That's the Canticle of the Creatures by St. Francis of Assisi, made into Brother Sun, Sister Moon, and very modern and environmentally up to date. And now we'd like to show you a lovely treasure house in London. Right in the middle of tourist London, you find, and I've only just found it recently, the National Poetry Library. And there are so many books of poetry for children, and it's just superb. So if you run out of inspiration, that would be a good place to find more. Thank you.